Thank you for purchasing a DF809 Hack Squat by Deltech Fitness. Your DF809 will ship in one large crate via truck line. The truck line will drop off the crate at the end of your driveway, and you will be responsible for carrying each part inside your house or garage. Take a small hammer and a flathead screwdriver and gently peel the lid off of the crate. When you get everything inside, you should have A. left foot, B. right foot, C. left frame rail, D. right frame rail, E. guide bars, F. rear uprights, G. foot plate, H. carriage assembly, I. foot cross member, J. seat cross member, K. weight bar, L. right arm, M. left arm, N. cross members, O. backrest mount, P. weight support, Q. calf attachment, R. weight storage pegs, S. weight sleeves, slide assembly, V. linear bearings, W. band pegs, X. weight rod, Y. safety catch, Z. pivot pin, AA. backrest, BB. shoulder pads, CC. seat pads, hardware, tools, and instructions. We will be working from the ground up, starting with positioning the feet where the leg press will be used. The feet have two sets of threaded bungs. The side closer to the end will end up being the back or tall part of the leg press. Next, we're going to grab the foot cross member. The foot cross member has two tabs welded to the middle of the tube. Line it up with the front two holes on the feet. Next, we grab our rear cross member. The rear cross member is made of a square tube with no holes or tabs. Line it up with the last two holes on the feet. Next, grab your Step 1 hardware pack and bolt the cross members to the feet. The bolts should pass through a washer, the foot, the crossmember flange, then get capped off with another washer and a lock nut. Don't tighten any bolts until all 8 have been installed. When all 8 nuts and bolts have been installed, go ahead and tighten the frame with some 19mm wrenches. All Deltech products come with nylon lock nuts. To get the bolt tight, you must use a wrench and tighten through the nylon lock. The nylon then keeps the bolt tight over time. Next, grab the rear uprights and the Step 2 hardware bag. Put a washer on the bolt, then bolt the rear uprights to the feet with the top flange facing the front of the machine. Only tighten the bolts hand-tied at this time. Installing the frame rails will be at least a 2-person job. Open your Step 3 hardware bag and keep the bolts close by. Place the frame rail on the foot with the weight catch arm facing the outside of the machine. With someone holding the frame rail, start the first bolt into the front hole. Once that bolt has been started and screwed in most of the way by hand, while someone is still supporting the weight of the frame rail, start the 2 top bolts. If the 2 top bolts refuse to go, loosen up the bottom 2 bolts of the rear support to give yourself more play. You might need to use a wrench to screw the bolts in, but do not tighten them at this time. Once all 4 bolts have been screwed in most of the way, but not tightened, start on the other side. Next, grab the long bolts from the Step 3 hardware bag, and it's time to install the top crossmember. I chose to use the black crossmember as the top. Thread the bolts through a washer, through the outside frame of the leg press, into the flange on the crossmember, then cap it off with a washer and nut. If the frame rails seem to be too far apart and don't want to come together to where you can bolt up the crossmember, loosen the bolts on the bottom of the feet. Only install the nuts and bolts hand tight at this time. Next, grab the seat crossmember and bolt it into the bottom 2 holes of the frame rails with the small tube facing up and out. Once all 4 bolts are installed, tighten everything down with a wrench. Now it's time to grab your Step 4 hardware pack and install the guide rods. Grab 1 bolt, washer, nut, and 1 guide rail. Run the bolt through the guide rail's top left corner with no washer, then through the frame rail, capped off with a washer and a nut hand tight. Next, peel the plastic protective film off of the linear bearings. We will install the linear bearings by rotating the guide rail so you can access the end. Feed 2 linear bearing blocks onto the guide rail, then rotate it back. Once the bearings are on, install the nuts and bolts. Each bolt will only have 1 washer, and it will be between the nut and the frame rail. You might have to pull up and move the guide rod around to get all the bolts through. For the bottom 2 bolts, you'll have to move the linear bearings up and out of the way. Now that all the bolts are installed, it's time to install the washers and nuts. Don't tighten any of the nuts or bolts until all nuts and bolts are installed in the guide rod. If you tighten one, then you might not be able to move it into place to get the bolt through the guide rod and through the frame rail. Once they're all installed, repeat the same steps for the other side. Once all the nuts and bolts are installed, it's time to tighten them down with some wrenches. I chose to use an electric tool to speed up the process. Now, we're going to install the carriage. Open up your Step 5 hardware bag and keep the bolts nearby. Grab some help to position the carriage and make sure the handle on the top of the carriage is facing up. While someone holds the carriage, bolt the carriage to the top bearing blocks. Start all the bolts by hand and don't tighten anything down yet. Only get them hand tight because they may need to move around just a little bit to align everything later. With the bolts screwed in most of the way, but not tight, it's time to slide the carriage up to the next position. Make sure that the weight support rods are facing up and move the sled. Once it's in position, rotate the weight support rods out to the side to lock the sled and gently set it down. Lift the sled, then slide the linear bearings up underneath it and bolt it into place. Once all 16 bolts are installed hand tight, go ahead and tighten them down with a 14mm wrench. Now it's time to grab your Step 6 hardware bag and the pivot pins. Install the pivot pins into the bushings on the frame rails. Make sure not to push the pivot pin outside the bushing, obstructing the foot plate. Now it's time to grab the foot plate and move it into position. Have someone hold the foot plate and slide the pivot pins through the bushings to hold it in place. Grab a small hammer and gently tap the pivot pins until they're flush with the bushing. Next, gently set the foot plate down. In your hardware pack, you have some shorter bolts, and then you have some smaller and larger M10 washers. We're going to be using the larger M10 washers on these bushings. Install the bolts into the pivot pins, then tighten them down with a pair of 17mm wrenches. Next, we're going to grab the long bolts, washers, and nuts from the hardware pack and install the slide assembly. Lift up the foot plate, then take the tape off of the bushings. Thread the bolt through a washer, through the flanges on the foot plate, through the bushings on the slide. Then cap it off with a washer and nut. Once the top has been installed, go ahead and take the tape off of the bottom bushings and repeat the same steps for the bottom. Grab the last small M10 bolt, install it into the nut on the bottom slide, then tighten all the nuts and bolts. Next, it's time to open the Step 7 hardware bag and grab the left and right arms. In the Step 7 hardware bag, we have some long M12 bolts and some shorter M10 bolts. We're going to use the M10 bolts, washers, and nuts to bolt the arms to the carriage assembly. Once the arms have been bolted to the carriage assembly and the nuts have been installed hand tight, go ahead and grab the weight bar and the long M12 bolts. Next, run the bolts through the weight bar into the weight carriage. You'll then hold the washer and nut underneath and tighten the bolt from the top to install them. Once one side has been installed, go ahead and repeat the same process for the other side. Now that both bolts are installed through the weight carriage, it's time to bolt the weight bar to the arms. Thread the bolts through the weight bar into the arms, then cap them off with washers and nuts. Once all 4 nuts and bolts have been installed, go ahead and tighten everything down with a pair of wrenches, including the arms. Now it's time to install the weight support. Grab your Step 8 hardware bag and the 2 flanges. Grab the 4 long M10 bolts, washers, and nuts, and run the bolts through a washer, through the clamp plate, into the carriage, then through the flanges on the weight support. Cap them off with another washer and nut. Once all 4 bolts are in, you can go ahead and tighten them down. Now it's time to install the weight rod. Push the weight rod into the hole of the weight support, then line up the threads with the small hole on the weight support. Thread the small bolt through a washer into the small hole, then get it started into the weight rod by hand before finishing it off with a wrench. Now it's time to install the weight sleeves. Grab the weight sleeves and slide them over the weight rod. Make sure that the weight sleeves completely bottom out. Once you've lined them up and got them installed, it's time to tighten the set screws on the weight sleeves to keep them in place. Now it's time to install the arm pads. Grab the arm pads and the Step 9 hardware bag. Thread the bolts through the washers, through the arms, and into the pads. Once all 4 bolts are in, tighten them down with a wrench. Now that all the bolts are tight, it's time to install the seat pad. The seat pad has 2 different length bolts. The shorter of the bolt goes through the smaller section of the seat crossmember. Grab the seat pad and line it up with the 3 holes on the seat crossmember. Use the long bolts through the thick part of the tube and the short bolt through the thin. Once all 3 bolts have been installed, tighten them down with a wrench. Now grab the backrest and lay it face down on the floor. Grab the backrest bracket, line it up on the 4 holes, then bolt it in place with the 4 small flathead screws. Once all 4 are in, tighten them down with the Allen key. With the back plate now installed on the backrest pad, you can mount the backrest pad to the machine. You can mount the backrest pad either on the top for a hack squat, or you can mount it on the foot plate to do leg presses. Finally, it's time to grab the Step 10 hardware pack and install the weight horns on the back supports. Grab the weight horns, the M10 bolts, washers, and nuts, and bolt them to the back rear supports. Tighten the bolts down with some wrenches, and we're ready to store some plates. I waited to do this until last so it would be easier to walk around the machine. On the bottom, there's holes that you can put band pegs through. Thread the band pegs through the holes with the T on the inside, and then you can wrap your bands around the band peg and then around the weight rod. Finally, your machine comes with a calf attachment. You can install the calf lift attachment into the foot plate using the pull pin on the bottom of the foot plate. Thank you for choosing Deltech Fitness.